in the right direction.
I call David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to take the call on this, and I'll just pick up on some of the initial comments made by the previous Speaker, Mr Goff. He observed that the last Parliament saw a remarkable number of justice bills going through, and that indeed the quality did not match the quantity of those bills. So when this bill was tabled shortly before the last election, it created something of a conundrum for the Greens. Here was yet another in a long series of corrections bill we'd been seeing from the government that gave us the 3 strikes legislation. Having seen that it failed miserably everywhere around the world, we imposed a similar regime here. The government gave us double bunking in prisons, legislation to deny all prisoners the right to participate in the democratic process by denying them a right to vote. The government that introduced the profit motive into the management of prisons. A government apparently committed to committing extraordinary sums of money to building more prisons, despite their own Minister of Finance assuring us that prisons are moral and fiscal failures. So when we started to read this bill in that context and started to see that actually it seemed to be quite a sensible and practical piece of legislation that could achieve some good ends, we had something of a crisis of confidence. We thought we must be missing something, but closer analysis led us to believe that actually this is a piece of legislation we can support. It does have some worthwhile aims. The content of the bill, its provisions, will improve the situation in terms of administration of community sentences, and for that reason we'll certainly be supporting this bill to the first reading, and with a reasonable expectation that we will support it throughout following readings. So all the evidence is that the greatest majority of offenders, for the great majority of offenders, community-based sentences are a better option than putting people in prison. There's a great deal of research that indicates that as a rule of thumb, probably about 15% of those people in prison actually need to be there. There is nothing else that can be done with them for their own safety, and critically for the safety of the public. We need to have those people denied their liberty. For the other 85%, community-based sentences are going to deliver much better outcomes than the failed experiment of putting more people in prison for longer. So corrections is now costing us well in excess of $1 billion per year. Some $850 million of that is spent simply on containing people, simply keeping people locked up inside concrete boxes surrounded by wire. That delivers an extremely poor return on that investment, to the extent that we're actually spending a great deal of money essentially to make matters worse. And that is not intelligent governance, that is not sensible policy, it's not good law. We don't need to spend more money to produce better outcomes. We need an intelligent, sensible program of justice reinvestment. Spend less money to get better outcomes. And this legislation does take us a step towards that, it would seem. We need to focus on crime prevention, rehabilitation, reintegration, which will deliver considerable economic as well as social benefits. Mr Cheval earlier gave us some numbers about the efficacy of community-based sentences. A rule of thumb I've heard is that typically with community-based sentencing and treatment, you can spend about half as much and double the quality of the output, and surely that's something that every government should seek to attain. This is an important bill to the extent it is quite a technical bill. It's a bill amending existing legislation, but it does seek to make more effective provision for the management of community-based sentences. It's not so much complex, it's very detailed, quite complicated. It seeks to amend 3 pieces of primary legislation, of course, the Bail Act, the Sentencing and the Parole Act. Something like 50 amendments collectively to all of those. None of those are particularly old pieces of legislation, dating back to the early 2000s. But the passage of time has demonstrated that there are gaps, there's failures of integration, that there are areas in all of those legislation. There are shortcomings. In some respects, provisions are contradictory or opaque. They don't give a clear steer to the judiciary or to those charged with managing community sentences. So it's entirely appropriate, in fact, very good legislation a good idea to look at that legislation and make it better. The point has been made that the legislation doesn't really align well with some of the available technologies that are now 10 years on available to us, so bringing that up to date is a good thing. So the regulatory impact statement identifies some of the issues to be addressed in the bill, and I'd like to comment on just on one or two of those. One of the changes to the Sentencing Act will be around the matter of pre-sentencing reports, basically assessment of suitability for home detention. And I'm pleased that there's going to be some light shone on that whole question. I've recently been in some dialogue with a number of people who are seeing some serious shortcomings in the reporting. Judges make sentencing decisions about whether or not home detention is an appropriate sentence based on information they are giving. And it's clear that the gathering of some of that information about particular sites, about particular offenders, is less than it could be. We are seeing poor practice both with government agencies and indeed with private contractors. And I think this process of going through this legislation will allow us to shine some light into that whole matter of the quality of the assessment of the reporting upon which judges are relying to determine whether or not particular offenders are eligible for home detention. So further provisions, there's the question, the matter of electronic monitoring has been brought up, the fact that if physical boundaries and the boundaries of the technology don't align, that creates problems, and we need to deal with that. And it seems perverse that individual offenders can be subject to two regimes of electronic monitoring that actually don't align with one another, and it's not clear which has priority. These are the sorts of issues that have thrown up, that the passage of time has thrown up, and it's entirely appropriate that these should be dealt with, and that it should be to give a clear steer to those whose task it is to make sure that these community sentences do work. I think it's important. I look forward to the Select Committee process on this bill. I think it's even more than usually important that we engage civil society. There are numbers of very well-resourced, sensible and proactive NGOs that work in this whole area of corrections, who have some very good progressive ideas, and I think it's important that we offer them every opportunity to make submission. As I said, something like 50 amendments to 3 already reasonably complex pieces of legislation. I believe engaging those civil society groups, those NGOs, will inform us. They'll reassure us that, in fact, we're not missing some or overlooking issues that could come back to bite us, or more importantly, that could come back to bite those who are affected directly by the provisions of this new legislation. So I do think that it'll be a particularly interesting Select Committee. I have some confidence that Select Committee will be very open to hearing and to responding positively to input from civil society, from NGOs. So, sir, against our general practice, I'm simply pleased again to say the Greens will engage with this bill, we'll support it, and we look forward to the conversation that it will influence. Kia ora.
I call Ian McKelvey.